cultural anthropologist and author Robbie Davis Floyd.
The technocratic model of birth is based on the principle of mind-body separation. It views the body as a machine and the female body as a defective machine in need of constant vigilance on the part of medicine.
Midwife and researcher Betty Ann Davis.
Well, I would say the key outcomes are sadness and fear, because what technocratic birth does is it puts people in a position where they think that they are in some way belittled because the technological birth has overtaken their ability to do it on their own. And that is why it's a problem.
Science and technology are supervalued, only not real science. It's science that proves what they think they already know it, but they look at, but they don't look at the science that supports normal birth physiology. The technocratic model is very much about aggressive intervention with emphasis on short-term results. Give that woman Pitocin, let's get that baby out as fast as possible, when there's absolutely no need for that.
The other thing that technocratic birth does, I feel, is it really changes normalcy into abnormalcy. Every woman is looked at as though she's guilty until proven innocent of a problem.
It's a profit-driven system that's intolerant of other modalities, and its basic underlying principle is separation of mind and body, separation of patient and practitioner, separation of parents from babies.
If they become instead enlightened and empowered by birth, they can take over something that they never thought they could before in their lives.
The Beautiful Work Challenge is an audio kaleidoscope that illuminates the essence, the current situation, and the potential transformation of the world's professions. It all boils down to, what's the good of our work? My name is Karine Pogarian, and I'm your co-host for the Beautiful Work Challenge on birth. And this is The Situation. 3500 BC dawns, and welcome to the new world. The sand is shifting, and what was once fertile grassland is fast becoming deserts, stretching from West Africa straight through Asia. Food has become scarce, and the men are picking up the slack. Step aside, ladies. We'll handle it from here. What's this? Looks like they're spreading out over the planet with a gospel of domination, militarization, and abuse. In no time at all, the thought of nurturing mothers, babies, and natural, youthful sexuality will be nothing more than a fairy tale. It's a whole new ballgame. Chapter 1. The Original Origin Tale. James DeMayo earned his PhD in Earth, Atmospheric, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Kansas. James published dozens of articles and several books, including Saharasia and In Defense of Wilhelm Reich. In 1978, he founded the Oregon Biophysical Research Lab.
My book, Saharasia, recounts that there is a hidden geographical pattern in human behavior that is embedded in all of the university literature, the scholarly research on human culture, anthropology, ethnography. There's a hidden geographical pattern in all of that data.
Actually, the birth processes of all traditional societies, whether foraging, hunting, gathering, or horticulturalist or agriculturalist, are extremely similar.
After a highly traumatic cesarean, Robbie Davis Floyd began to ask women about their birth experiences. She went on to interview 100 women, which became the basis of her renowned first book, Birth as an American Rite of Passage. Robbie has been a professor of cultural anthropology for over 20 years and has been honored throughout the world for her work.
Anthropologists call these pre-modern birth practices, and they were all very similar. I mean, there was a lot of cultural variation. Some cultures have food taboos. You shouldn't eat this, or you shouldn't eat that, or you shouldn't stand in doorways because that will keep the baby from coming out, or you shouldn't tie knots because that will make a knot in the cord. Those kinds of things vary widely between cultures. that there is this amazing similarity among the characteristics of birth in non-modern or traditional societies of all types.
Well, the terms matrist and patrist have been used by a couple of scholars previous to me as a way of defining something more specific or explicit than the more popular terms matriarchal and patriarchal. A matrist basically means a complex set of variables where infants and children are treated in a gentle way, where children are raised with a gentle hand. There's no beating of children. There's no pain-inflicting rituals to infants or children, that there's a great deal of mother-infant bonding, maternal-infant bonding, which means breastfeeding. It means close physical contact, skin-to-skin contact between the mother and the baby, a lot of handling of the baby. Fathers are involved with supportive roles for the children, as well as are the brothers. There's also a lack of things like class systems or caste systems or slavery. Those are the hallmarks you find of the not necessarily only patrilineal, but the patrist systems, the patriarchal authoritarian systems tend to go in that violent direction. Or it could be that the wives are slaves of the husband, like in multiple polygamous marriages in the Muslim world. Most women in this world are slaves, semi-slaves if you want. They cannot determine their own futures. They are duty-bound by honor obligations to certain roles within the family. And the making of sons becomes a primary obligation for women to affirm their status within that kind of society. Matrist culture avoids all of that because the essentials of a nonviolent society include the two major ingredients. One, that mothers and babies bond emotionally, lovingly. And secondly, children are allowed to have their sexual play. And as older children and adolescents, they migrate towards sexual relations in those early years within their peer group. They don't have pedophilia because the adults are healthy. When you orient them towards those two major points, what you find is that all the other variables fall in line in a certain patterned way that when you map it out on world global maps, it's unmistakable. There's a hidden pattern that is revealed in the ethnographic data.
So I've worked or interviewed traditional midwives in Guatemala, Afghanistan, Peru, Brazil, Mali. And I actually worked among the Black granny midwives in Alabama in the late 70s before they lost their licenses. And in all the places, I find very similar things. These practitioners are just very human. And what that means is they just do stuff that makes sense.
Betty Ann Davis is a midwife with over 45 years of practice, a researcher in epidemiology and the social sciences, and a professor of women's studies. She is the only midwife in Canada with hospital privileges to attend breech births without a transfer to obstetrics. She is co-editor with Robbie Davis Floyd of Childbirth Models on the Human Rights Frontier.
The major thing for me is that traditional midwives have intuitive responses, that we have somehow put them aside. We put them on the back burner. We put aside our intuition because we feel whenever anything happens, we instinctively stick to our protocol instead of just thinking about what's really needed here. And what happens is we start to think that those things are the things that are least important, when in fact, those are the things that are most important. They know things about how to get a woman to do what she needs to do and how to help her.
If you go across the worst deserts of the world, North Africa, Sahara Desert, Arabia, the Arabian Desert, the Rub al-Khali, the deserts of Central Asia, or the other parts of the Middle East, the Syrian desert, the big deserts of southern Central Asia, such as the Iranian deserts and the big deserts of Western India, the Rajasthan, the deserts of Iraq, of Pakistan, and so forth. All of these deserts are one huge contiguous region. And that is the region where you find the most violent cultures in the entire ethnographic database. And by violent, I mean they have pain-inflicting rituals on their children and infants, circumcision, genital mutilations. There's strict, heavy-handed obedience training where children are routinely slapped around and beaten. sexuality is totally crushed. And we're talking here about this big region. And in those cultures, you have honor killing of young girls who violate a sexual taboo, even if they're already well into puberty when the sexual drive is very strong in young people. I'm a geographer by training, which means I know things about the history of climate and big, massive climate changes that occurred in ancient times. That big region, which I call Saharasia, that region was a wet, well-watered grassland if you go back before around 3,500 or 4,000 BC. So this raises all kinds of questions, because if you go back at that time period and you look at what the archaeology tells us about what human behavior was like, the best evidence that you can find suggests that they were also matristic in their orientations. You can tell this, for example, by the lack of fortifications and weapons of war to be found in the most ancient of the archaeology. Once you hit the time period around 4,000 to 3,500 BC, you begin to see all kinds of evidence for war, for violence, for weapons. What I found in my own study is that regional archaeological summaries showed that violence and warfare had a point of origin in each world region that you could point to. And they all were timed with the onset of this massive event of desert formation. Now, under those conditions, you wind up with some very unsettling findings that a child who is raised under conditions of starvation also suffers from maternal isolation and deprivation. And those factors, starvation, which leads to severe retardation of the growth of the brain, of the whole nervous system, with kwashiorkor and marasmus, you have that problem, but then you have the maternal isolation because the mothers just simply can't take care of children anymore. Everybody's in a terrible condition. Those factors lead the child to grow up into an adult who is sexually dysfunctional, who is violent towards their own offspring. And this is where you get the starting point for this origins of violence. And it's confirmed not merely in the theoretical context of the modern studies on starvation and chronic malnourishment, but it's confirmed in the archaeology, and then it's confirmed in these larger geographical patterns, what we see in the more recent ethnographic data.
Cultural anthropologist and author Robbie Davis Floyd.
Pre-industrialization, birth characteristics were quite similar across populations. They involved upright positions and moving around a lot and changing positions frequently, eating and drinking at will, being supported by relatives, friends, and skilled midwives in traditional societies. And that all changed with industrialization. So there's this similarity that characterizes traditional practices before industrialization that results from our evolved biology. We evolved to give birth in upright positions. Our pelvis opens more when we're in upright positions. Pushing is more effective when we're in upright positions. But after industrialization, when birth was moved into hospitals, women were forced to lie down for the convenience of the doctors. That in itself, just lying down for labor and birth, made labor and birth much more dysfunctional, much less likely to happen normally and naturally.
Michael Klein is a family physician, pediatrician, neonatologist, and maternity care researcher based in British Columbia. Michael is best known for his randomized controlled trial that led to a dramatic drop in episiotomy rates across Canada and beyond. He is the author of Dissident Doctor, Catching Babies and Challenging the Medical Status Quo.
Before the 1920s, most births took place at home, and the discipline of obstetrics and gynecology did not even exist as obstetrics and gynecology. Birth was in the hands of midwives and general practitioners. Perhaps the most important person in all of this was an obstetrician. He was a gynecologist at the time, named Joseph Bolivar de. And Dr. de is a very mixed character. He ran the Chicago Lying-In Hospital. And the Chicago Lying-In Hospital was caring for people who basically came from the slums of Chicago. the mortality rate for mothers and babies was very high. Everybody knew a mother who had died in childbirth. And critical issue there was poverty as opposed to problems of inadequate care. Rickets was widespread in the slums of Chicago, which led to narrower pelvises and obstructed labors and so on. It was Dr. DeLee's idea that we had to get childbirth out of the homes and into the hospital. But from a political perspective, he was very, very influential. He spoke to the American Association of Gynecologists in Chicago in 1920, and he gave a very famous talk called the prophylactic forceps operation. And what he was saying to his audience was that we need to make childbirth a surgical discipline. And what we're going to promote, and he said this, he was a wonderful speaker. What I'm promoting, and the results are just marvelous for both the mother and the child, is the use of the widening of the vagina through episiotomy and what we would call today lift out forceps. And of course, they were using twilight sleep and anesthesia so that the mother was totally passive, and they would do a surgical cut and then they would lift the baby out with forceps. But he said something even more profound in that talk. He said that if you undertake these two procedures, these two link procedures, you will gain control over the entire territory and you will wrestle it away from quote unquote incompetent midwives and general practitioners, because they will not use these techniques. And we will turn childbirth into a surgical discipline and own the territory. Well, it was a speech that absolutely transformed maternity care.
Look! The door's opening.
Something's coming out.
People of Earth, and the United States in particular, I'm afraid the changes needed for widespread healthy birth will make your head spin. What does she mean?
What's she saying?
You'd have to say goodbye to much of what you think of as progress.
Like money isn't the key to medical excellence?
Medical occupations and institutions would need to be re-envisioned.
What the?
Your economic structures, how healthcare is delivered, even the way you practice medicine would have to transform. Right. Good luck with that. You're not leaving.
Wait. Hey, how about some details?
Chapter 2. The Rulers of Birth. Physician and researcher Michael Klein.
In North America today and throughout the world, there are two paradigms that are at war with each other around childbirth. One paradigm continues to say that childbirth is a normal process. It's reasonable to be vigilant. The other paradigm says that childbirth is nothing more than an opportunity for things to go wrong, an accident waiting to happen. Pregnant women are unexploded bombs that need to be defused. These are entirely different ways of seeing this process that we call childbirth.
Cultural anthropologist and author Robbie Davis Floyd.
Doctors go through 4 years of med school and then 3 or 4 years of residency and specialization, depending on what specialization they pick. And during that entire time, they're subjected to what is called the hidden curriculum in medicine, which is the unconscious modeling of behaviors that experienced doctors and resident teachers perform, where they treat the patient as an object. They talk in language the patient can understand. They unconsciously with their bodies and their movements, they model this attitude toward patients that they transmit to medical students who are subjected to intense bombardment of information. Like in any rite of passage, the initiates are bombarded with new information in a way that shuts down their ability to think and analyze, and they just have to memorize and just take it in without critically analyzing it or asking themselves if they want to be learning what they're learning or if they like the values that are implicit in what they're being taught.
Penny Simkin is a physical therapist who has specialized in childbirth education and labor support since 1968. She has prepared over 13,000 women, couples, and siblings for childbirth and has assisted hundreds of women and couples through childbirth as a doula. She is author of many books and co-founder of DONA International.
What do obstetricians have to gain if they perceive and treat birth as a pathological event? So I think what they have to gain is a justification for a lot of what they learned in medical school. It's hard for an obstetrician who's had, 8 years of training or something, to be working side by side with a midwife who has gone through 4 years of college and maybe has a master's degree after that, to think that she has skills. I'm saying she, and I'm being sexist, but most midwives are she. But the midwife has skills that the doctor doesn't have. The midwife knows how to use a position or hand movements or just a nice hug to help a woman settle down or help the baby find a better position, et cetera. And obstetricians don't know that. They know how to use, or they used to know how to use forceps, but now they know how to do a cesarean and get a baby out. So I think that one can feel belittled if they're told, well, you don't have to operate right now. You could try pressing on the belly this way or having the mother squat or something like that. That might do the trick. But it's a very narrow way of looking at babies being born. And some obstetricians who train with midwives are very proud of what they've learned from midwives. And they brag about it a lot.
Robbie Davis Floyd.
The body is regarded as a machine, and the female body especially is regarded as a dysfunctional machine. From the beginning of Western obstetrics, obstetricians always have seen female bodies as defective insofar as they are different from male bodies. So female processes like menstruation and childbirth and menopause have always been medically coded as pathological in some way and needing medical care and medical intervention.
Michael Klein.
It leads very naturally into the next debate, which is the debate about cesarean section. Because in the 30s, when I was born, the cesarean section rate was 3%, and now it's 30%. And you could be a trained obstetrician in the 1930s and even up to the 1950s, and you could go through your whole training and never see a condition called placenta accreta, where the placenta gets attached to the wall of the uterus and won't, it's stuck and won't get unstuck. And that's a direct consequence of prior cesarean section. And now it's a regular occurrence in any large hospital because of the routine use of cesarean section in some places, which go up as high as 60%.
Babies are made healthier by normal physiologic birth because passing through the vaginal canal tones their bodies and squeezes their lungs and gets them ready to breathe, and also colonizes them with the mother's bacterial flora called the microbiome, which colonizes the baby's gut and gives the baby immunity to a lot of diseases and a much healthier start in life in a way that can prevent diseases later in life that babies born by cesarean will be much more susceptible to when they get older.
Physical therapist and childbirth educator Penny Simkin.
It's really a bad idea for most pregnant people to have a cesarean. It really messes up the abdomen. Once a cesarean, always a cesarean in this culture. Only about 10% of women who have had a cesarean in the past will be able to have a vaginal birth in the future. And it isn't because their bodies can't do it. It's because physicians are afraid of a vaginal birth coming from a scarred uterus. The evidence does not support that, but this is the usual practice.
Take a Brazilian obstetrician that my student interviewed.
He told a woman who came to him wanting a vaginal birth, he says, look, for me, it's simply not worth it. For a vaginal birth, I have to be on call. When you go into labor, I have to show up at the hospital and check you. I have to wait for maybe 24 hours until you give birth to your baby. That means I'm not attending my private clinic and seeing my private patients where I do make money. I don't get paid any more for a vaginal birth than I do for a cesarean. It's simply not worth my time to wait on you to give birth to your baby naturally. So I only do cesarean. If you don't want a cesarean, don't come to me. And that is a very common attitude in Brazil. You make a heck of a lot of money when you induce everybody, when you do cesareans on everybody, when you use drugs on everybody. Capitalism is antithetical to normal birth.
What is important is power.
Ricardo Herbert Jones practiced for over 30 years as a home birth and hospital attending obstetrician and gynecologist in Brazil. Ricardo introduced a model of support for laboring women that included a midwife, a doula, and an obstetrician for each of his patients. He is the author of Chronicles of a Humanistic Obstetrician.
This model, where we have 95% cesarean section rate, like in my city, in Brazil, in middle-class women, doctors have most of power. They are powerful. They decide when babies are going to be born. They decide when women go to the hospital. They decide everything. Doctor has 100% of power. Women have no power at all. They cannot choose. They cannot have their babies the time the babies want, or they decide. No, doctors decide for women. So even though we know, and even the doctors know, it's not ignorance. They know that vaginal birth is safer for babies and moms. But they decide to do the cesarean section for any false reason, like the cord is around the neck, we need to do a cesarean section. Oh, the cervix is too hard, so we need to do a cesarean section. Oh, you're 41 weeks pregnant, so we need to do a cesarean section. They always have these false justifications to make their patients have a cesarean sections. Because for a doctor's perspective, vaginal birth and normal birth are terrible.
Robbie Davis Floyd.
Doctors constantly say to women, I saved your life, I saved your baby's life by performing a cesarean, even though the reasons for the cesarean were caused by the interventions that the doctor himself made in the normal physiological process of birth. That's called the obstetric paradox. You intervene in birth ostensibly to make it safer, but by intervening, you make it more dangerous. So having made it more dangerous with technology, you then throw more technology at it to try to make it safe again. I call that the 1-2 punch of mutilation and prosthesis of the process of birth. Punch 1 is mess up the natural process with technology. Punch 2 is fix the mess up you made with more technology.
Midwife and researcher Betty Ann Davis.
It's not the medicalization of birth that's improved outcomes. It's the discovery of life-saving measures that has definitely improved outcomes for certain women. But the problem with the discovery of any new medication or new methodology, such as doing a cesarean section or doing vacuum extraction or forceps, is that it tends to be used more than it's needed. And I do think on some levels it does have something to do with the patriarchy, in that men just seem to love tools. When you're afraid, you tend to go to instruments that can be dangerous. So that's the trouble with medical and technical types of instruments and drugs, is people think that they need to be used, and often they don't need to be used, and they just overuse them. And part of that, of course, what drives that? The liability. Litigious society drives that, because they feel that if they haven't done all of these interventions, then they will be sued.
Penny Simkin.
It's a big question about oxytocin and cesareans. Who gets the benefit from those? Is it the mother, the baby, or the obstetrician? Big question.
Betty Ann Davis.
Well, we just know that there are certain hormones that contribute to fetal and newborn well-being. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, catecholamines, they're hormones. And we know that along with oxytocin, there are large effects on maternal hormonal physiology. They really impact fetal and newborn hormonal physiology, maternal and newborn. And they have to work together. And so, when you do something like you purposely augment a labor or purposely start to induce it, you're not really looking at the baby's well-being necessarily. The baby's maturity is often essentially determined by the fetal cortisol production. So, and that has to be coordinated with the mother's readiness to go into labor through her estrogen production and other processes. The timing of the physiological onset of term labor has always been really difficult for us to predict because of the normal variations. And you have to be at a point where the systems are fully primed, both the mother and baby, and precisely aligned for the safe, effective labor. That's why if you're using artificial oxytocin, sometimes it's not really working very well because the mother's not ready to accept the pain, because we know that the synthetic oxytocin, for some reason, does not seem to go through the brain barrier the same way the normal oxytocin does. The outcomes for an induced labor can be that it doesn't work because the mother can't take the pain and she wants an epidural, and then she ends up on her back, and then she ends up with more instrumental birth. Yeah, it becomes a problem. And inductions are done so freely these days.
Penny.
I feel a mission to make sure my students, my pregnant students, know this, so that if a doctor says, let's get it over with, she might say, no, I want to give the baby a chance to start the labor, because then we'll know the lungs are mature. And it might be that even 2 or 3 more days in the womb would benefit the baby. So I want them educated so that they wouldn't think it doesn't really matter as long as you're at 37 weeks or beyond. It doesn't even matter when you have the baby. It's all the same. Not true. And we know that babies continue to grow and develop in the womb until they're born. So it's very important that parents have a sense of the value of maintaining that pregnancy.
Michael Klein.
Maternal mortality in Canada is around 3 per 100,000. In the United States, it was running about 5 to 6 to 7 per 100,000. However, in certain pockets in the United States, let's say Alabama, where poor people are not getting the medical care that they need and where they are suffering from the diseases of poverty, the United States has a rising maternal mortality rate. In Alabama, it's almost 20 per 100,000, which is just, it is a catastrophe. And these are people, because of the inadequacy of medical care in the United States, are dying without medical care or without prenatal care. And even when they get into medical care, they come in late, then they have obesity, the kind of obesity associated with poverty. And that's why the maternal mortality rate is going up. In addition, of course, the perinatal mortality rate is going up in the United States, which is a scandal and is directly related to poverty and the absence of a coherent healthcare system in the United States. In Canada, we have a national health system which covers all the population. In the United States, it covers only 70% of the population.
But we do know that one big cause is racism, and especially the African-American population. The African-American mothers are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than a Caucasian mother. And it crosses even economic lines. So, for example, Serena Williams, the great tennis player, had a near miss. And partly, we think it's because there's an attitude among many that Black people can't give accurate reports, and they might complain more of pain than others. And so therefore they tend to be ignored. And that is being documented at this point. I think in the United States, we've sort of thought we're the best because we spend the most on maternity care. We make doctors take training longer than anybody else. So therefore we must be the best. And I think that what we have been shocked to find is that more is not better. More intervention, more money spent on care, more hospitalizations, more medications, more surgery does not result in better outcomes.
The United States has excess bed capacity. Every time you put a warm body in a United States bed, somebody makes money. The hospital makes money. Hospitals compete with each other for patients, and they compete with each other for procedures as well. So childbirth is a money-making procedure. A cesarean section may cost in some places for the patient as much as $5,000 to $10,000 by the time they get through. In Canada, unlike the United States, every time you put a warm body in a bed, somebody loses money because hospitals are on fixed global budgets, and those budgets are provided by the federal government to the provinces. In the United States, they would want to keep people longer because they simply bill the patients or they bill the insurance company. There's no incentive to reduce this because all the insurance companies do is they raise the rates to cover the costs. So the hospitals and the insurance companies are literally in bed together.
We have such awful outcomes compared to the rest of the industrialized world, but it seems that our practices are snapped up by many of the developing countries. It's a mystery. But, you can't put your finger on it and blame one doctor. It's a whole culture.
What happened is that along with electronic fetal monitoring, we developed a whole cadre of anesthetists who were devoted to childbirth. We created an industry of epidural anesthesia. And epidural anesthesia has now become the norm that the majority of women laboring in the United States and Canada get an epidural. And there is an ongoing fierce debate about whether epidurals increase the cesarean section rate or the forceps rate or other procedure rates. And there's no question that they do. However, the results of those studies have strongly disputed by what has become the anesthesia establishment that we have created. Once you have an epidural, you have to have an IV. Once you have an epidural, you have to have continuous electronic fetal monitoring. Once you have all of that, you have nurses who are having to look after the intravenous and the oxytocin, which is used about half the time, which when you have an epidural, you have to look after the monitor. You have to spend huge amounts of time writing, taking notes to make sure that you have adequately described the labor. And so we've actually studied the amount of time. At McMaster University, they did a wonderful study where they looked at the amount of time that a nurse spent literally hands-on touching the patient, and it's 15%.
So until those studies started to come, everyone thought, oh, the electronic fetal monitor is, the best thing since sliced bread. Theoretically, it would seem to make sense that if you could trace every single heartbeat of the baby all the way through labor, that you'd be able to pick up times when the baby was not getting enough oxygen and maybe protect the baby against getting brain damage from inadequate oxygen. And I think that was the hypothesis that this whole custom was based on. And it was not based on, let's try it out and see if it makes a difference. Have a group of babies that are randomized to be monitored constantly during labor and another set that are taken care of the usual way with a stethoscope placed on the belly periodically during labor. And they found that when they finally subjected it to randomized controlled trials, they found that it didn't improve outcomes and that it was expensive and it kept people in bed and it had a lot of disadvantages to it. And it's subject to interpretation. There was one study that was done in Montreal where they had 5 different teaching hospitals, and the professors of obstetrics in each of those institutions, they were all given 22 different fetal monitoring tracings to look at and to make a diagnosis. And they're all the same ones. And there was no agreement among those 5 experts. They all had different interpretations of the fetal heart rates, which was demoralizing. But then 2 months later, they sent the same tracings back to the same professors, and the professors gave different answers than they had given before.
Well, if you do a home birth, for example, with a midwife, of course, you don't have electronic fetal monitoring, you don't have epidurals, and you have continuous touch and contact between the caregiver and the woman. If you add a doula into that situation, you are able to show how strongly you can improve outcomes, and in spite of not having all that technology available. And if things don't go well, of course, you can always transfer the woman, if you're worried, to the hospital where she'll get all that the hospital has to offer. The question really is, what is the contribution of the hospital's way of managing birth with all the technology to the rising cesarean section rate and the complication rates that we see versus what we see in home birth?
In the meantime, people were losing the ability to hear the heartbeat and to interpret from the sounds of the heartbeat. The traditional midwives, or the midwives who use the regular stethoscopes, are really good at interpreting a heart rate that is faltering and taking a very long time to come up versus one that is faltering for a very short time, etc. they can use their ears to figure out what's going on. But most of our nurses and our hospital personnel can't do that anymore.
In Canada, in British Columbia, and in Ontario, we have studied home births. And we've studied home births in their entirety. These are studies that are not samples. They involve a total population. So, for example, we studied every single home birth for 5 years. And we studied during the same time period every hospital birth by the very same midwives who attended the home birth. And the results are so good that, for example, in British Columbia, the College of Physicians and Surgeons has rescinded its prohibition against physicians participating in home birth, which was what existed until relatively recently, meaning that the research is so clearly showing the benefits of home birth that there's no way that the College of Physicians and Surgeons can argue against it. So in that study, we show that the maternal complication rate and the newborn complication rate is the same in home birth as it is in hospital birth. However, when I'm talking about major complications, the cesarean section rate is dramatically lower among those people who start their labor at home. And what's interesting is that the cesarean section rate for the very same midwives in the hospital is more like the cesarean section rate for the physicians in the same hospital than it is for the same midwives at home.
We do have some pretty good science now that shows that nurse midwives who are practicing in the hospital use interventions at a much higher rate than non-hospital midwives. There are restrictions on what the nurse midwives can do in the hospital. There are protocols and there are rules to follow. And they would be seen as loose cannons if they let labor go beyond certain guidelines that are laid down in the hospital. So they're kind of pressured to stay within specific protocols and, letting labor go on too long or not intervening quickly, having women walk around the halls and things are some things that may be against the rules in the hospital.
It's not the hospital's fault. The hospital just behaves the way hospitals behave. Hospitals are concerned with risk management. Hospitals are concerned with professional competence. They're trying to protect themselves. The reality is that many of those women who chose to have a midwife and a hospital birth could have had a home birth. The amount of money that would be saved would be huge. A hospital birth costs more than double a home birth. Not only that, but in Canada, the home birth is paid for by the public purse. The midwife is paid for her work with public purse. In the United States, the midwife has to be paid out of the pocket for the most part of the patient. In Canada, if a woman is laboring at home and the midwife starts getting concerned, she calls the hospital. The hospital doesn't try to second guess her. They send the ambulance. They get the operating room ready and they receive the woman and the midwife, and they do so in a respectful manner. In the United States, midwives in that kind of situation are, face all kinds of negative pressures and abuse, frankly. And so to talk about home birth in the United States is to talk about a non-system. And until the obstetricians stop worrying about themselves and start worrying about the mothers that they're supposed to be serving, you're going to get this kind of bad result.
Betty Ann Davis.
Essentially, what I find is that it's really a competing system in which proper healthcare as a human right is on a collision course with global capitalism and privatization. And within a privatization module, I find also that the competing health professionals who work in an environment that creates bullying of clients and each other becomes really difficult. And that just happens because of the way the system is set up.
Michael.
Many years ago, an American sociologist named Barbara Kat Rothman wrote an article entitled Midwifery an Almost Profession. Fairly provocative title. Well, what she was really saying is that if you're not an autonomous profession, you're not a profession. In Canada, midwives are an autonomous profession. They are not responsible to obstetricians. They're responsible to the College of Midwives. There is no comparable organization in the United States. And midwifery in Canada, in my view, has played an absolutely central role, holding on to childbirth as a normal activity. I think the most important thing that they do is they keep women out of the hospital.
Robbie.
So ideal birth models would be that obstetricians attend around 20% of the high-risk births that are actually where their surgical skills are actually needed. And midwives attend around 80% of the birth, supporting normal birth physiology. That actually is the case in New Zealand. And their model is working extremely well with extremely good outcomes and extremely high patient satisfaction rate. That's the difference. Babies are going to get born most of the time, no matter what you do to the process. So, for example, in Greece, which has a cesarean rate of almost 70%, the outcomes of birth are the same as those in New Zealand. In Greece, the cesarean rate is super high. All births have technological interventions. Every woman either has an episiotomy or a cesarean, so it's the cut above or the cut below. But the mortality rates are exactly the same as the mortality rates for New Zealand, which has a woman-centered model where midwives attend the vast majority of births and obstetricians are reserved for those few births where they're actually needed. The difference is not in outcomes, it's in maternal satisfaction. It's not in terms of mortality. It's in terms of mothers feel much more psychologically satisfied with their birth experiences and thus are more empowered to become good mothers to their children, good and loving mothers, because the bonding process is not interrupted in physiologic birth.
Obstetrician and gynecologist Ricardo Jones.
I think that doctors should not assist normal birth. It's too tedious for doctors. Many hours doing nothing. You're not taught in medical school to do nothing. Doctors are taught to do something, to do a surgery, to save patients, to open the abdomen and take a tumor, or to open the abdomen and take a baby that is in jeopardy. So doctors are not prepared to be people that assist birth. To assist birth, you need to go to another realm. It's different. So you need to prepare a specific professional that has the calm, the patience, and the skills, and the spirituality, the connection to assist the birth. Doctors are not prepared for that. Doctors are prepared to be the heroes of the hospitals. They must be the hero of birth.
On today's episode of When Birth Goes Bad.
Is anything all right?
This woman is pregnant. She needs a doctor.
Who is calling me?
Oh, doctor. Kim, you look HOT hot. How did you get your figure back so quickly after making that baby?
Well, Twinkie, I started exercising immediately after my planned cesarean. I went from the hospital straight to my gym.
You are an ROLE role model.
Aw, and I've been on an ultra-organic juice fast that really sheds the pounds. You know, these fruit trees don't touch dirt.
It's like you never had a baby.
What baby?
Oh, you.
Honey, I'm home with the anchovies and rum raisin ice cream. I don't want that. I changed my mind. Okay, what would you like now? Third trip to the deli could be the charm. It's hell to be pregnant. I know.
No, you don't.
No, I don't. Next week on When Birth Goes Bad.
The ward is stacking up with emergency births. Thank goodness you're here, doctor.
Just doing my job, nurse. Chapter 3, eBirth.
Women need information on birth.
Edwin van Teyingen is a professor of reproductive health research and a medical sociologist whose work focuses on public health and the organization of maternity care. He is involved in improving higher education in Nepal, including the transition from textbook teaching in healthcare to finding the most appropriate evidence-based treatment for each patient.
And women have always needed information on birth. That's 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Traditionally, they would get it from their elders, they would get it from their mothers, from their mother-in-laws. In more recent history, they would get it from books, they would get it from leaflets, they would get it from paper-based information. And I think more recently, women have been getting information from a wider source of media, especially television, radio, and then more recently, web-based sources of information. So I think for two reasons. It's partly because there is more information available, easier accessible than in the past, a wider range, but also women are less likely to get information from their parents, from their mothers, from their mother-in-laws, because they don't live in the same city anymore. They don't live in the same street anymore. They're less likely to talk about events, normal events of birth. Women are having less children. So in the past, a woman would have 6, 7, 8 children. So by the time the oldest daughter had children, her mother would still have a toddler in the house or a young child in the house. So it's a different way of living.
I think also why women rely on media is because birth is hidden from view.
Anne Luce is an associate professor in journalism and communication. Anne's research focuses on media representations of childbirth and labor, suicide, and the marginalized voices of the disabled. She is author of The Bridgend Suicides, Suicide and the Media.
We don't actually see birth anymore in our communities. Edwin has alluded to that in the sense that, women used to have babies with their mothers and sisters and aunts, and it used to be a family event, a community event. But actually, we've moved away from that now. So women aren't taught about birth. They don't know what it's going to be like. They have no idea. They've never been, they may go on a tour of a maternity wing in a hospital, but for most women, that's the first time that they're coming up close and personal to birth. So media becomes the default. It becomes the educator. It becomes where women turn to get information, to see what it's going to be like. We don't see the actual act of childbirth on TV, in movies, but we see enough that women can somewhat prepare themselves for what could happen.
We, especially women, but just the same for boys and men, because they don't see childbirth in their families in the same way as they did in the past, it becomes something to be fearful about, because it's the fear of the unknown. As Anne said, and your average midwife will tell you that the average woman hasn't seen childbirth until she's in labor herself, and the same for her partner. So it's not as if she'd been to, or even been in the same house or in the same room as when her sister gave birth, or a sister-in-law. We don't have those experiences anymore. So therefore, they become media type of experiences, and therefore it becomes potentially something more to be fearful about.
I think from what we found in our research is women are afraid about childbirth. So there's a fear that develops. Now, the question we've been grappling with is which came first, the chicken or the egg? So are they fearful because they're not seeing it? Or are they fearful because of what they're seeing on TV and in the media? The fact that women, because of this fear, are going to hospitals earlier than they should. And what's happening is we're seeing a cascading range of interventions that are then happening that are costing healthcare systems billions around the world. We're seeing women having interventions that are not medically necessary. And that's having an impact on the actual labor and, the birth itself.
The media portraying childbirth as something that is special, something that is risky, something that is likely to go wrong. And Anne can tell you more about it from a media kind of perspective, but our notion is that childbirth in itself, 9 months in pregnancy, labor being 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, is incredibly boring as a media event. It is slow, not much happens. So it doesn't make good television. It doesn't make good radio. It doesn't make for a good media event. So what we see in the media, in run-of-the-mill films, in television programs that are not about childbirth per se, we see childbirth as something that is odd, that is risky, that is different, and therefore that needs intervention, and therefore you get the the example of Rachel in Friends. But in real life, that's an outlier, that's an oddity, because for most women, childbirth will be relatively uneventful. It'll be very important for them individually, but as a life event, in terms of things happening, it is not a good media event.
And the fact is that birth has disappeared from view. We don't talk about it. We don't educate young girls about it in schools. If they're in school, they're watching a video of a screaming pregnant woman in a health class, and it's under the guise of abstinence. You don't want to get pregnant at the age of 16. So let's show you a scary video and not provide any context to it. And there's your education about what could potentially happen to you if you have a child. There's no discussion about the prenatal care. There's no discussion about, the things that come after the fact, how your body changes during the birthing process, how for some women, it makes them so in tune with their bodies. For the first time in their life, they're actually living in their bodies. They're mindful, they're present. For others, it's a little bit more traumatic, and they have to engage with that. But, there's support systems that can help them with that. But we're not actually talking. The media has nothing to do with any of that. We've lost the relationships that women have had with each other, where the tribe came together and helped a woman bring a child into the world and then supported that woman. Takes a village, to raise a child. Well, where's the village now?
There are a number of issues to think about. So the first one is, we're talking in English. A lot of programs, films, are in English, and they get either subtitled or dubbed into local languages. So if I'm watching television in Nepal, sort of half of it is sort of Nepali, Indian kind of programs. The other half are American or British programs. So there is a notion of globalization in the reach of the media, and therefore ideas about obstetrics and maternity care, of what a hospital looked like in Nepal, is maybe people who have seen pictures from the UK in television programs, or in the US. So people have specific expectations that might then be partly based on what they've seen on television. If you go to places like Nepal, cesarean section rates in the biggest cities are very high. Some as high as in American hospitals. So if you go to the private hospitals, the cesarean section rates are higher than the public hospitals. The private hospitals are getting better off women who are healthier, better nourished, higher class, higher caste, and they end up at more cesarean sections. Logically, that doesn't make sense.
So women are sharing this information, which is great, but they're also sharing misinformation, which is problematic. And we've seen evidence of women, asking questions on a closed Facebook group and then getting, 4 different responses from other women within the group who are all very well intentioned. But again, it goes back to fear. There's, something was perhaps said in a midwifery appointment, and taking all of that information in a 10 or 15 minute, 20-minute appointment with your midwife. And then you go home, and as we all do, we start thinking and rethinking and playing, and well, what does that mean? And, why didn't I ask that? And before long, you're now Googling to find out what is the worst case scenario. And, you've gotten yourself worked up into a frenzy, and you go onto a Facebook group. Can you please just help me? I think there's something wrong with me and my baby. When actually, if you rang the midwife, she'd say, no, that's fine. You're in normal. Those are normal blood levels. Don't worry about it. It's all good. We looked at Twitter and Facebook. So women on Twitter who are going to Twitter to look for some support, they're not getting it on Twitter. But for women who are pregnant, it's companies selling them prams and strollers and, baby genies and, all the kit that you allegedly need to have a child. Facebook is where we were finding women are supporting each other. It's the Facebook groups. Instagram is where they go to visually represent.
The whole notion of childbirth is not only being medicalized, but also commercialized. And if you look at the kind of things that you need, or that women perceive that they need for childbirth, in terms of expensive prams and strollers and breast pumps and clothes for babies and kit for the baby room and baby showers, all these are driven largely by commercial companies. Birth as a proper physiological event, you don't really need anything or anybody. So childbirth is a very low cost. So breastfeeding is the simplest way of feeding a baby. You don't need any paraphernalia. You don't need any tools. You don't need any expensive kits. But what we see is a large industry in terms of selling breast pumps and sterilizing equipment and all sorts of other paraphernalia, items, goods, out of which money can be made. So I think there is an impact of capitalism in terms of making money out of it and making women believe that they need that.
I think there's definitely a relationship that's, in the fitness and beauty industry that is being shown to women who are pregnant. And, and there's a belief that they have to look a certain way and they have to carry themselves a certain way. And you should be looking fabulous all the time. And that's just not the case for a lot of women. You want to be comfortable during your pregnancy, not wearing, stilettos with 4-inch heels. It's just, it's impractical really for the everyday woman. We're not all Kardashians, so we can't be walking around. And I think that also that feeds into fear in a different way. It feeds into fear around not performing your pregnancy in the correct manner. It then feeds into not being a good mother when, once you've had your baby.
One of the things I think in terms of the influence of the media is the influence on men, and men have an impact on their partners. And we know from the literature that men are often more conservative. They're more likely to, in terms of childbirth, they're more likely to trust the technology. That they're more likely to push their wives and partners to go to hospital than the women themselves. There is also an indirect influence of the significant other, the woman's partner, and many of those are, of course, male, in and around events of childbirth.
Well, I think then we're getting into issues of gender for me, and what it is to be a woman in this society, and that we're not in control of our own bodies, or there's an illusion that we're in control of our own bodies, but actually doctors tend to be men. And I think probably it's a subservient thing that's going on as well, that we're quite submissive as women. We don't always, speak our minds, I'm being general here, but I think there's the patriarchy.
The medical profession is the most powerful profession of all in terms of society, in terms of the way they can dominate the way people see them, their work, and their impact. So definitely greater impact than university professors, or greater authority, greater power than lawyers or politicians.
All of that stuff comes into this, for me at least. And I think it's scary. It's scary when you're lying back on a bed and having to open your legs and someone is going near your vagina. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. And I think it's more vulnerable because we don't talk about our bodies. We don't, we're hidden from view. Bodies are, supposed to be hidden. We've got all these names for women who wear short skirts and shorts. And there's a whole discourse around the female body. And I think that's probably part of it.
The medical profession claims that they can deal with our fears of falling ill, things going wrong with their body. The legal profession can help us when things go legally wrong and we're taken to court. The religious professions, priests and ministers, help us with our fear of the afterlife. And I think that notion of fear is also in the media. So we are constantly, or especially the younger generation, constantly on Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform it is, because of the fear of missing things, missing information. So we've got this constant flow of information. And I think fear is also part of the beauty industry. It's the fear of imperfection. So the beauty industry, the media, the medical profession are working on aspects of our fear. So that might be one of the kind of elements that brings it together.
All of that stuff comes into this, for me at least. And I think it's scary. It's scary when you're lying back on a bed and having to open your legs and someone is going near your vagina. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. And I think it's more vulnerable because we don't talk about our bodies. We don't, we're hidden from view. Bodies are, supposed to be hidden. We've got all these names for women who wear short skirts and shorts, and there's a whole discourse around the female body. And I think that's probably part of it.
One of the key elements of any profession of staying into power is dealing with fear. So the medical profession claims that they can deal with our fears of falling ill, things going wrong with their body. The legal profession can help us when things go legally wrong and we're taken to court. The religious professions, priests and ministers, help us with our fear of the afterlife. And I think that notion of fear is also in the media. So we are constantly, or especially the younger generation, constantly on Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform it is because of the fear of missing things, missing information. So we've got this constant flow of information. And I think fear is also part of the beauty industry. It's the fear of imperfection. So the beauty industry, the media, the medical profession are working on aspects of our fear. So that might be one of the kind of elements that brings it together.
Wonderful, wonderful. The lovely lute of Jaunty Joaquin. Thank you, Jaunty. Welcome once more to Gutenberg's Guzzle and Gazette for another special evening of entertainment. The medieval Times calls it a must-read. It's on the nightstand of every judge and witch hunter in Europe. Of course, I'm referring to Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, penned by those favorites of Pope Innocent VIII, Reverends Kramer and Springer. Indulge me as I recite one of my favorite passages. For this must always be remembered as a conclusion, that by witches we understand not only those which kill and torment, but all diviners, charmers, jugglers, all wizards, commonly called wise men, wise women. But be most on guard for these beneficial witches, which do no hurt but good, which do not spoil and destroy, but save and deliver. It were 1,000 times better for the land if all witches, but especially the blessing witch, might suffer death. And remember, no one does more harm to the Catholic Church than midwives.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind.
Chapter 4. The Inquisition continues. Midwife and researcher Betty Ann Davis.
There is, in my estimation, definitely a worldwide witch hunt. It was something that we started to see in the 80s. It was a term first coined by Marsden Wagner when he started to testify for midwives. And the first case was actually in Ontario, where there had been a baby death. And we decided we were going to either use this court case towards the efforts of legislating midwives, or it was going to be a way of destroying midwifery forever. And of course, we felt that we could work with our legislatures here in Canada to push for legislation and standards so that people would start to take us seriously, because that's the only way you're going to be taken seriously, unfortunately.
Robbie Davis Floyd.
I need to do a book called The Global Witch Hunt, because so many of these practitioners who are human rights pioneering in childbirth, who are practicing truly evidence-based care, which means doing the normal physiology of birth, they are being persecuted, imprisoned, losing their licenses. I mean, massive persecution by the obstetrical establishment. in countries all over the world. And I'm going to write a book or edit a book where they tell their stories. I'm going to find 25 of them and get them to tell their stories in this book that I'm going to call The Global Witch Hunt, because the Inquisition is not over. It's still happening. And it usually happens to the most skilled practitioners, who are the ones who are willing to do breaches and twins, even maybe at home, because they know how, and the doctors have no clue. They only know how to do cesareans for that. So yeah, that's my next book.
Ricardo Jones.
We can see in Brazil a witch hunt of humanistic doctors. So doctors that support the work of midwives are being persecuted, are being attacked by the medical board, by the government, by the powerful people. And it happens in Hungary with Agnes Gereb. It happens in the Netherlands. It happens in Germany. It happens in Argentina with a friend of mine. So a lot of doctors are being attacked. A lot of midwives are being attacked, because now the population around the world can witness the decay of this idea that birth is better in the hands of doctors. So now we have evidence-based medicine showing us that birth outside the hospital, in home birth or birth centers, are better than hospitals. Birth that happen in hospital are more dangerous. Births that are assisted by doctors are more dangerous than births that are assisted by midwives. So now we can check it. We have a lot of papers showing studies, researchers doing all over the world that show us this reality. And so doctors are feeling threatened by the knowledge and by the power that women are giving to midwives, humanistic doctors, and out of hospital assistants. And so they are feeling threatened, and so they are counter-attacking. So attacking the humanistic doctor, attacking midwives, attacking doulas all over the country. Because now they know that for the first time in this century, we can show that the assistance given by doctors to normal birth is not the best assistance that we can have.
Robbie.
In Ecuador, there was this fabulous private hospital called La Clínica Primavera, the spring clinic. And they had 2 birthing rooms with tubs. They did such beautiful normal births. They made videos of them, publicized them all over the world. They were a lot of people went there just to give birth in their hospitals, some other countries. And it was a magical, amazing system with incredibly good outcomes. The 2 owners of it, Diego and Lily, are now serving 7 years in prison for doing normal births. And the police came and they dug up the grounds around the hospital looking for dead babies, because they were sure that nobody can have outcomes that good. And so they must be just burying the babies that died. And of course, they found nothing.
Betty Ann Davis.
I've testified at numerous cases. I testified in Castlevania for one of the midwives who was being singled out. It's not that I don't think that some practitioners may have things that they're doing that are unethical and dangerous, but I think that the way the legislative system runs is there's a power imbalance where the physicians have more power, and what they say in a courtroom tends to be what the judge thinks is true. And that's really unfortunate. Probably the most famous current case is the case of Aggie Garab. Agnes Garab is an obstetrician turned midwife. We first met her in 2004. My husband and I went down to Hungary, which is where she lives, to present at a conference.
Childbirth educator Penny Simkin.
But in Hungary, they treat women terribly during labor. I know Agnes Garabin, bless her heart. I visited her in her apartment, and I just couldn't believe the way she was being treated. She was accused of allowing a baby to die in a home birth situation, and it might have been twice. She had experts go over her records and go over the case, and these were inevitable deaths. Some babies do die, but they just clamped down on her. I mean, this is the very worst of male superiority coming down on women. When I was there in Hungary, I was very shocked. I was trying to give workshops, and a lot of things just didn't make sense to them because they never heard of them.
Betty Ann.
Around that time, Hungary was really picking up on home birth, but the Hungarian obstetricians were clamping down on them as they became more and more vigorous in their resolve to have more home births, the obstetricians, again, tried to suggest they didn't know what they were doing, tried to get them practitioners. So Eggie, in particular, was vulnerable and a target because she had already been an obstetrician and had made a decision, a deliberate decision to become a midwife and do home births, which made it look even worse. So that's why she became a target.
Robbie.
Yeah, she's been pardoned by the president of Hungary. So she's now free. The only problem is that she can't practice for 10 years and she's 67. So although he pardoned her, and that means she doesn't have to go to prison and she's free to travel, she's also devastated. I mean, you'd think she would be thrilled that she doesn't have to go back to prison. But so many birth activists from all over the world wrote the president of Hungary. I wrote him. Everybody wrote him. And we begged him to let her go free and revoke the prison sentence and withdraw the charges and allow her to practice again as well. But he refused to allow her to practice for another 10 years. And at 77, who knows what kind of shape we'll be in. So she's devastated because she was hoping against hope that she might get to practice again. Because, she was trained as an obstetrician, but eventually she rejected obstetrics and went to midwifery training because she realized that midwifery training was much more suited for supporting normal birth physiology, which is what her goal was, to help women have healthy, happy, psychologically empowering birth experience.
Penny.
In England and the Northern European countries, they do a great job with birth. I think Southern Europe and Eastern Europe don't do so well. And then Asia is another matter with lots of different forces working against normal birth there. We do have horizontal violence, in our hospitals where staff are bitching at each other and not cooperating. And if someone is like Ricardo trying to do something different and better, not respected. So I guess if we just said that, is this happening all over the world? Yes.
Ricardo.
And so the whole medical profession was going toward a direction of more medicalized birth, more intervention, more cesarean sections, more drugs, more time in the hospital, more procedures. And I was going to the other side, to the opposite side. And so in a way, my colleagues were always trying to diminish my efforts to humanize birth. One of the ways to do that is to say that you are a fanatic. They used to say you are the fanatic of the normal birth. And saying so, you are against technology. So you don't respect all the advances in technology and procedures that we have in the last 100 years in cesarean sections. And so you do not respect all the teachings that you received in the medical school that taught you to intervene, that taught you to use drugs. And I was doing the opposite. But the fact is that I was not fanatic. I was just trying to be conscious. And I was just trying to use technology only when it is necessary and not for the hospital benefit and doctors' benefits. So a way to diminish and to attack the opposition is to try to label this person as a person against technology or a fanatic. And that began in the first day that I came to the hospital as a resident, and I was 25, 26 years old, saying that I read a book and I was studying positions for birth, and I decided to do birth in vertical positions like squatting position. And 30 years ago, to say that in Brazil was the same as saying, you're crazy, you're stupid, only Indians do that. Indians in Brazil are not intelligent, Indians are primitive. So women from cities, they are not able to squat, they are not able to have their babies. It's dangerous for babies. Baby can fall on the floor and break the heads, things like that. Stupid things. But I knew that my intuition was saying, of course, it's much more easier for a woman to have a baby in a vertical squatting position than to lay flat on this table, this absurd table that we use to assist birth in Brazil. But from that time on, they labeled me. This is the fanatic of the normal birth. This is the one that wants to do things in a different way. This is the doctor that is trying to modify the protocols and the routines in the hospital. The thing is that I've been bullied for more than 30 years in my city by the medical community, calling me to the medical board to make complaints or doctors complaining because I gave interview on television or on the newspaper saying that, yes, home births are safe. And we have the experience of countries in Europe where home births are safer. And we can have this type of birth in Brazil as well. We had a home birth, that the baby was born pretty well and the baby was okay. But we decided to transfer the baby to the hospital after 2 hours of observation because the breathing was not 100%. The baby went to the hospital. The baby was in observation for 3.5 hours. And then the baby began to behave badly and badly and badly. And eventually, 24 hours after that, the baby died. And they decided that that was the moment to make this doctor accountable. That was the moment they decided they were going to take away my license because I was assisting home births. And this kind of thing happens all around the world. You see doctors and midwives being attacked by not behaving exactly the way that the medical board decides. And in a sense, after 30 years of bullying, for me, it was kind of a relief when they took away my license because for the first time, I could relax and not be attacked by the medical system.
Robbie.
It is an extraordinary example of how patriarchy works. Because they're men and because they're wearing white coats and they have degrees, they have the authority and their knowledge is considered to be authoritative. It's absolutely true. Doctors have ruined traditional birthing systems all over the world. They've ruined them by teaching the midwife the wrong thing and then wondering why maternal mortality rates don't go down when they teach the midwife to carry a little kit that they give them with scissors that can't be sterilized. They used to, traditional midwives will cut the cord with maybe a freshly cut sliver of bamboo, which is actually sterile. And then here comes the doctor and says, no, you have to use sterile scissors. And it's interesting when doctors used to give training courses to traditional midwives, and they would train them to do births with a woman flat on her back. And the midwives who had been doing vertical births for, like I said, millennia sometimes, because it was a doctor who had so much more status, they thought, well, he must know what he's talking about. I guess I've been doing it wrong all these years. And they would start doing birth with a woman flat on her back, and then they discovered it doesn't work very well.
Betty Ann.
Well, there's power and prestige as well, right? I mean, it's really different. When you start to realize, I guess midwives we're just accustomed to being treated like lesser thans, realizing all the time that we're actually more with women than the average practitioner in a hospital who has got the designation called physician. But it's really difficult for physicians in positions of power to see that anybody else might have a different way that might be better. It's just really difficult for them. I call it the law of shackles because it puts physicians in positions that often, I don't even think they want to be necessarily in. The society's put them in a position where they feel that they are at the top of the totem pole. And it's always better for everybody if they didn't take that attitude. But the attitude is promulgated by society and also promulgated by women because they would get off their pedestal if women would get off their knees. It's very often that you find that women just, in spite of all of it, they'll have a prenatal class, they'll understand everything about it and understand how they need to face up to someone bullying them into doing something, but it's still really hard for them to see it.
The Beautiful Work Challenge on birth continues with the transfer. What happened?
Is that how you're ending the episode?
Fiona, is there a problem?
Sounds like there's nothing but problems.
Well, we can't just sugarcoat a pretty bleak situation.
But it feels a bit overwhelming, don't you think?
Well, the situation isn't the whole story. There is more to say.
Serena.
How about we get the transformation ball rolling a bit?
I like it.
Perfect. Chapter 5. To Life. Robbie Davis Floyd.
Oh, I would like to see a switch to evidence-based care. That would do it. Just boom. Switch care. Make sure everything you do is evidence-based. That's an idealistic goal because there's not clear evidence on everything. But step number 1, stop admitting women before 6 centimeters of labor. The latent phase of labor lasts up until 6 centimeters. And that phase can normally and naturally and healthily take place for 4 days or more. As long as you're eating and you're drinking and you're getting a little rest and the baby's heart tones are being monitored, latent labor can go on for a very long time. If women stop being admitted in latent labor, the cesarean rates would immediately drop because a huge reason for cesareans is called failure to progress. But most women are admitted before they're even in active labor. And then, of course, allowing women to move about freely, to eat and drink as they wish during labor, to have artifacts for physiologic birth in hospitals.
Betty Ann Davis.
We need dynamic communities around the world that choose to topple prevailing medical powers. And so technocratic birth is something that is an external force. And although it's trying to save babies, and that's often the language that's used in technocratic birth, we really think that really to preserve safety, you need to have appropriate care for citizens during pregnancy and childbirth. And usually the citizens know what kind of care they want. If they try to approach the system, they often are in a battle. And we've really seen this as we've watched Indigenous groups and people who are trying to have reproductive rights put on the table. Feminist writers point out the dangers in investing state structures with the responsibility for achievement of feminist goals, because there's an importance in women struggling instead to establish practices like self-defense classes and institutions like battered women's shelters and birthing centers, because it becomes a way of empowering women to develop what it is they think they really need. If you expect to be getting from a government institution what you really want, you have to be very careful to understand what the limitations of that are. And often people understand that once they set their foot in an institution like a hospital, even in some of the birth centers that are government run, they are really putting themselves into a situation where they suddenly have a lot of rules imposed upon them, which they might not have normally thought that they needed.
Ricardo Jones.
In birth, I would like to see more midwives working. I would like to see more doulas allowed to go to the hospital. Many hospitals in Brazil don't allow doulas because they use the false excuse that doulas can bring bacteria and germs to the hospital. This is ridiculous, because at the same time that you don't allow a doula to be along with the patient during childbirth, they allow the photographer of the hospital to take photos. So this is absolutely ridiculous. So I would like to see more doulas allowed to births, more birth centers in Brazil. We need hundreds of birth centers. They have the best quality because they are assisted only by midwives. And I would like to see all hospitals opening doors to midwives for them to practice and to show the high quality of assistance that midwives can bring to birth. This is not difficult to do. I think that we need to begin in the universities. So put more midwives, programs for midwives, and less programs for obstetricians, because we have thousands of obstetricians in Brazil. We have a lot of obstetricians. In my city, we have more obstetricians in my city than entire France. And my state has 10 million inhabitants, and France has 40 million inhabitants. And we have more obstetricians than France. We have much more obstetricians in my city that we have in the Netherlands. So we need to take all these guys off the market slowly, of course, slowly. It will take 20, 30 years for the total replacement. But we need to replace obstetricians assisting birth in hospitals by midwives, prepared, skilled midwives, and to do this job, because they are the best practitioners, the best caregivers to assist birth.
Edwin van Tailingen.
So my personal hobby horse is I would like to see more home births, and I would like to see midwives attending those births. There are many countries in the world, and America is one of them, but there are far too few midwives who provide a much more social, psychological kind of care, less medical intervention than obstetricians and doctors in general. There are always signs of hope. There are always signs of people becoming aware of things that could be improved. I think some of the Facebook pages we looked at, we saw really interesting, positive in the sense of seeing childbirth as a normal physiological event, and women talking about it in that kind of way, about the joy of being pregnant, becoming aware of your body, really the amazing notion of creating new life. And that is there. So I think there is hope.
And Luce.
I think the thing I would like to see is better education. I think this has to start back in schools. We need to be, from the time a young boy and a young girl is, entering the school system, we need to be talking about their bodies. We need to be talking about, what feels good. What are these sensations? I think across the world, Bessel van der Kolk talks about it quite significantly. We have this mind-body split that has occurred, and we don't know how we're feeling, and we numb ourselves now. We numb ourselves with food, with alcohol, with drugs, with shopping, and it's to hide feelings, but it's because we're not connected to our bodies. And so I think the education has to start early on about keeping us in our bodies, then educating us about what our amazing bodies can actually do. And for girls, it has to be, let's talk about pregnancy for real. Let's talk about the act of having sex, the act of conception. Let's talk about what happens if you do happen to fall pregnant. Let's talk about, it should be a subject. I mean, we've watered down health education to, abstinence and don't smoke and do drugs. I mean, it's, we can do better. We have to do better, because I think that's where the change has to happen. It has to happen in those younger years in schools. And then those conversations have to be carried out into the home. They have to be carried over into the home. And as we continue to have the conversation, that's how discourse changes. In terms of hope, most definitely. Yeah, there's hope. I think it's great that women are finding support systems in an online environment.
Edwin.
I just want to mention men one more time. And I'm serious, because I think when Anne talks about education, we need to be very careful not to talk about education of girls or for girls. We need to talk to boys about childbirth, about breastfeeding, about menstruation, because we don't. And because we don't, they don't know. You get misconceptions and you get media filling the gap of what we know about, we as men, as boys know about childbirth and any related kind of issue. So education, and especially of children, need to be of both the boys and the girls.
Penny Simkin.
We know that people get into an altered state of mind when they're in labor if they feel safe. And I've seen this over and over again. And I've often said, if I could be with a person for that 1 hour when she goes from being this conscious, alert person in early labor to being this instinctual person in mid-labor, that's the time I would want to be with everybody. I love seeing that transformation. But the doula can help a person stay in that instinctual state. And I'm absolutely convinced of this. And I can't prove it scientifically, but damn it, I'm right. And I just pound my fist on the table to say that. We, as doulas, we can match her mood. If she's getting into an instinctive place and she's kind of moaning or grunting or, we don't ask her a question. We do it. We moan right along with her. We help to keep her in that instinctual state where her body is taking over. Her body knows what it's doing.
Michael Klein.
In the 1970s and 80s, there was a movement which some called the humanization of childbirth. It happened on both sides of the border. And that was when radical things took place, like partners were allowed in the delivery room, like birthing beds started to appear, where single-room maternity care started appearing, where you have you labor, delivered, and recovered in one room. All of these were positive results. But associated with them were a reduction in routine procedures that could not be defended, like episiotomy, like shaving, like enemas, routine IVs. All of those things stopped happening. And the drivers for all of that were women themselves. They formed organizations, childbirth education associations. There are relatively few people who are complaining about the medicalization of childbirth. In fact, we're having increasing numbers of people who are deciding to have cesarean section in a preemptive fashion. And in Canada, where you really can get a qualified midwife, you're seeing the opposite trend taking place. Is it possible to develop a movement analogous to the successful movement of the 1970s? The problem is that those people thought that they won the war, when in fact the war has simply shifted to another battleground. And whether it's possible to, in the present era, to offset forces that are going in the other direction is something I'm afraid pessimistic about.
Betty Ann.
I really would like to see everyone take off their shackles and everybody sit back and figure out what a woman really wants and not posture. Posturing among professionals is really, really difficult. And that goes for midwives and physicians alike. I think that there's just a lot of that because we are thrust into a system that does that. The reason it's so nice to have a home birth is because there's no posturing and there's no pecking order. Women just do whatever they want to do and they're in their own home and they're in charge. When you go into a hospital, everybody else is in charge. And that's the reason why it's really wonderful for a woman to just stay put, and because she's in her own home instead of the hospital, which is the practitioner's home. So I would just like to see everybody not think that the way they're doing it is the only way you can do it. How do you help women to, and all practitioners actually, not bow down to a system that is really broken? It's a really broken system. And that involves the doctors and the mothers and the fathers and everybody who's involved. It's just really difficult. And as soon as you step out of your role and become human, you become a target because you're not doing what the system wants. The system is built on efficiency and capitalism. So women need to take charge by learning as much as they can and going in with a series of demands and questions. They should do that. They should try to do that rather than assume that the professional is going to know everything. Because professionals in this society, I feel, are all traumatized. They're all dealing with some kind of trauma. There's so much bullying going on among professions and between the professions. Women have to be aware of that because traumatized professionals traumatize women. If you have instead a situation where you have a milieu that is working really well together and there isn't all that professional posturing, women do better. And women really do have to get into the place where they are saying, this is what I want. They have to be really clear. And to do that, they have to go and search. They often don't do that till their second pregnancy when they've had a C-section already and they go, what happened? So in order for women to get off their knees, they have to take that on. And then everybody becomes more human. As soon as you start to speak up, everybody starts to realize, oh yeah, okay, so we are all equal partners in this process, but the mother is really the top of the totem pole.
Thank you for joining us for the Beautiful Work Challenge on birth. And thanks to our situation guests, Robbie Davis-Floyd, James DeMayo, Betty Ann Davis, Michael Klein, Penny Simkin, Ricardo Jones, Edwin Van Teyingen, and Anne Luce. Special thanks to everyone who subscribes to Catalista on Patreon, where contributors can access merch and bonus birth interviews. The Beautiful Work Challenge was edited by Tim Kirby and Gijsbert Ambashir. Sound design is by Rich Cutler and Jay Blanchett. And mixing comes from Viren Dakan, Gijsbert Ambashir, and Mark Tulk. Our music is composed by George Jennings. The executive producers are Chicky Munch and Binny Bunny Munch, with assistance from Ed Goldberg, Nikki Hatsidis, and Gerald Gerbil. You can find the current schedule of Catalista podcasts and sign up for our weekly email at catalista.net. If you enjoyed the Beautiful Work Challenge, please add, comment, and like us on your favorite podcast platform. This is Karine Pogarian, signing off from the Temple at Catalista Centrale. See you next time for part 3 of On Birth, the transformation.